In today's video, we take a look at climbers whose entitlement and ego collided with the world's highest peak. From dismissing Sherpa warnings to pushing alone into the death zone against clear weather advisories, these decisions left no margin for survival. It was February 14, 2015, at Everest Base Camp. The North Col route faced pre-monsoon storm conditions, with gale-force winds and bitter cold. Snow whipped across the exposed ridges, visibility was near zero, and prayer flags snapped violently against the white backdrop. At this altitude, even minor missteps could be fatal. Among the climbers preparing that morning was Brianna Hastings, 31, a Boston-based corporate compliance manager. She had no winter or high-altitude mountaineering experience, and relied entirely on previous mild season-guided treks. Hastings approached the climb with a mindset shaped by control and dominance. She believed confidence and mental toughness could override the mountain's rules. Posted advisories and repeated warnings from guides emphasized that ascending alone in current conditions was life-threatening. Hastings ignored these cautions, insisting on proceeding without supplemental guidance, framing the expedition as proof she could master challenges others feared. As she moved above the upper camps, the climb became increasingly hazardous. Trail markers were obscured by fresh snow and wind, leaving her dependent on memory and limited GPS navigation. Spindrift, fine wind-blown snow, penetrated every layer of clothing, wetting insulation and reducing its effectiveness. Ice crystals formed on her gloves and face protection, impairing dexterity and making even simple movements, like adjusting backpack straps or holding trekking poles, difficult. Every step required careful placement on hidden rock or ice, but poor visibility made footing unreliable. By early afternoon, gusts approaching 90 miles per hour struck without warning, catching Hastings off balance on an exposed ridge. She stumbled into shallow depressions between boulders as trekking poles were ripped from her hands and her backpack waist belt tore under wind pressure, eliminating her main points of stability. Snow blew into her face, freezing against goggles and mask, and visibility dropped to near zero. Each successive gust drove her further along the slope, increasing contact with snow and ice, while wet clothing accelerated the loss of body heat. Hastings attempted to activate her GPS emergency beacon, but frost-numb fingers prevented proper operation. The device slipped from her grasp and became partially buried in snow. For the next 40 minutes, she crawled between rock outcrops and small ridges, seeking shelter from the full force of the wind. Hypothermia progressed rapidly. Uncontrollable shivering gave way to loss of fine motor control, confusion, and impaired decision-making. Attempts to call for help were incoherent, and she became increasingly disoriented regarding position and descent direction. Eventually, Hastings could no longer move, unable to maintain balance or recognize safe terrain. Breathing slowed and became shallow as hypothermia affected cardiovascular and neurological function. Consciousness faded while she attempted to use her phone, unaware that the device had no reception. Even minor movements like turning her head or shifting weight required immense effort. By the time rescuers reached her location the following morning, she was found unresponsive, partially shielded by boulders but fully exposed to the storm. Her climbing partner contacted base camp hours after she failed to check in. Extreme winds, steep terrain, and ongoing storm conditions initially made rescue impossible. Once teams reached her, the body was partially buried under wind-deposited snow. The medical examiner determined severe hypothermia as the cause of death, with exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. The GPS beacon was recovered nearby, but would not have enabled timely rescue under the conditions. The incident highlighted the extreme hazards of winter climbing on Everest. Exposure to sub-zero temperatures, high winds, and blowing snow can overwhelm even physically strong climbers. Confidence, social media goals, or prior fitness cannot replace preparation, adherence to guide instructions, or respect for the mountain's limits. In extreme conditions, rescue options are extremely limited, leaving little room for error. It was June 23, 2016, at Everest Base Camp, where unusually warm pre-monsoon temperatures hung in the air. The tent city buzzed with climbers preparing gear and rotations, while thin air carried the sense of stoves, glacier ice, and yak meat. and prayer flags snapped against the Khumbu Glacier. Kendall Wexford, a 28-year-old pharmaceutical sales manager from Seattle. She had built her career on aggressive efficiency, refusing to accept delays or limitations, and approached mountaineering with the same mindset. Wexford's experience included moderate peaks in Nepal and the Pacific Northwest, but none involved technical glacier travel, rope team coordination, or high-altitude hazards above 20,000 feet. She had hired a mid-tier Nepali guiding company and considered their role primarily as logistical support rather than technical instructors, viewing safety protocols as optional barriers to completing her summit push on schedule. Wexford repeatedly dismissed concerns about warm temperatures and unstable snow bridges, arguing that speed and efficiency were more important than caution. Over the following days, she ignored standard rope team procedures, skipped team briefings, criticized base camp logistics, and insisted on advancing ahead to demonstrate her preferred pace, leaving guides frustrated and increasingly concerned for her safety. The first glacier rotation to Camp 1 exposed the risks of her approach. Crossing crevasse fields at high altitude, Wexford hesitated and rushed intermittently, ignoring probe testing. Her guides attempted to enforce rope travel and spacing, but she unroped herself and advanced ahead. Warm conditions had softened snow bridges, making them unpredictable under weight. At Camp 1, she demanded minimal rest and insisted the team maintain her schedule, dismissing recommendations to pause until ice and snow conditions stabilized. On the second rotation toward Camp 2, Wexford continued to flout standard safety protocols. She pressured her guides to increase the pace, skipped proper spacing in the rope team, and refused to probe or test snow bridges at critical crevasse crossings. Even under repeated warnings, she insisted on advancing alone, ignoring flexing snow bridges and the unstable conditions caused by unusually warm temperatures at high altitude. While crossing a visibly weakened snow bridge spanning a wide crevasse, the structure collapsed beneath her, sending her plunging into the narrow chasm. During the fall, she struck sharp ice edges and a protruding rock shelf, fracturing both femurs and sustaining severe internal trauma. Her backpack and helmet shifted violently, causing additional blunt force injuries as she tumbled against the crevasse walls. The crevasse was too narrow for rescuers to see her directly, and the high walls reflected sound poorly, making communication nearly impossible. Her headlamp illuminated only a small area around her, revealing snow debris and ice shards, but no stable footing. Blood loss, shock, and blunt force trauma caused her to lose consciousness within 20 minutes, leaving her completely dependent on technical rescue teams to reach her before prolonged exposure worsened her condition. The guides immediately initiated crevasse rescue procedures, but warm snow and unstable anchors significantly slowed operations. A satellite call to coordinate additional support confirmed that helicopter evacuation was impossible due to rotor hazards over the narrow opening. Ground-based technical rescue teams required 4 hours to reach the location with specialized equipment. Wexford's body was recovered at 12:30 p.m. The medical examiner determined death was due to massive internal bleeding from blunt force trauma sustained during the fall, with contributing factors including bilateral femur fractures and early hypothermia from exposure. The incident reinforced the extreme hazards of high-altitude glacier travel in unstable conditions and underscored the necessity of strict adherence to guide authority and rope team protocols. Expedition companies subsequently revised safety agreements to prevent clients from overriding technical instructions during hazardous climbs. It was August 8, 2017, at Everest Base Camp during the late summer monsoon transition. The tent city remained active with acclimatization and route work, while recent snow and warming cycles had destabilized sections of the Khumbu Glacier, prompting warnings after near-miss ice incidents. Paisley Dalton was a graduate student specializing in human risk behavior in extreme environments. At 33, she approached Everest with academic confidence shaped by years of theoretical study, rather than practical exposure. Her research focused on decision-making under perceived danger, and she had frequently criticized expedition safety policies as overly conservative. Her field experience, however, was limited to controlled observation and short-duration high-altitude travel under supervision. Dalton's stated goal was to document climber behavior during non-peak conditions for thesis material. She viewed guide-imposed restrictions as obstacles to legitimate research rather than safeguards developed through prior fatalities. Despite being advised to remain within established movement windows and to avoid solo travel through unstable sections, she insisted that her academic credentials justified independent movement. She logged her intent to move ahead of her group, stating that her research objectives required autonomy. That morning, Dalton left base camp intent on advancing higher along the standard route through the Khumbu icefall. The climb required deliberate pacing across shifting ladders, crevasse crossings, and unstable ice blocks that constantly changed shape under temperature fluctuations. Other teams moved cautiously in fixed rope lines, spacing themselves carefully to reduce load stress on snow bridges. Dalton focused on documenting conditions and proving her independence in hazardous terrain, separated herself from the structured pace of surrounding climbers as she continued upward. As Dalton moved above the lower camps, conditions deteriorated quickly. Snow bridges across the glacier showed visible signs of weakening, and shifting cloud cover reduced visibility across the route. Guides advised holding position and rerouting around a section of icefall that had been flagged as unstable earlier in the day. Dalton ignored the recommendation and continued forward alone, choosing a shorter line that crossed the compromised area. She paused frequently to document surface features, extending the time spent in hazardous terrain. The glacier surface became increasingly uneven as she progressed. Subtle depressions and thinly covered ice concealed underlying voids, making safe foot placement difficult. Meltwater from recent warming cycles had weakened structural support beneath the snowpack. Without rope support or probing, she stepped onto a section that appeared solid but lacked load-bearing integrity. The snow collapsed beneath her without warning. Dalton fell into a concealed ice depression, striking hard ice during the descent. The impact caused multiple fractures and severe internal injuries. Loose ice and snow followed her into the cavity, further restricting movement and visibility. The confined space prevented self-extraction. Shock and blood loss rapidly limited her ability to move or call for assistance, while exposure to cold ice surfaces accelerated heat loss. Within minutes, her condition deteriorated to the point where coordinated movement was no longer possible. Dalton remained conscious briefly, attempting to call for assistance and stabilize herself, but blood loss and trauma progressed rapidly. Hypothermia compounded her condition as she remained immobilized on exposed ice. She lost consciousness before any assistance could reach her position. Her absence was reported hours later when she failed to check in. Rescue teams located her after conditions stabilized, but she was unresponsive upon arrival. Medical assessment confirmed death due to internal injuries and exposure sustained during the fall. The incident was recorded as a preventable fatality, resulting from deviation from established safety protocols. Expedition leaders reinforced restrictions on independent movement and emphasized that academic expertise does not substitute for situational awareness or compliance with guide authority. The case was later referenced in mountaineering safety discussions as an example of how theoretical knowledge can fail catastrophically when it overrides real-world risk controls. It was September 3, 2014, at Everest Base Camp during the late monsoon transition. Afternoon clouds formed rapidly over the upper ridges, and lightning had been observed across nearby peaks in recent days. Route managers warned that exposed sections above the South Col offered no shelter, advising climbers to descend promptly if storm conditions developed. Skylar Pemberton, 26, was a Denver-based social media consultant who had built her online presence around dramatic outdoor content. Her Everest experience consisted of guided rotations in stable weather, where decisions about pacing and safety had been handled by professionals. She framed risk as proof of character, often dismissing caution as weakness, and viewed unpredictable conditions as opportunities to capture compelling footage rather than as hazards requiring restraint. Her stated objective was to live-stream summit content in marginal weather, to distinguish herself from other climbers documenting clear sky ascents. Guides emphasized that lightning above treeline presented uncontrollable danger, and that no equipment could mitigate a direct strike. Pemberton argued that forecasts were exaggerated and insisted on continuing upward despite visible storm formation over nearby ridgelines. By late morning, clouds thickened above the upper slopes. Distant thunder rolled across the mountain, and static electricity began affecting exposed metal equipment. Other climbers began descending in accordance with established safety windows, but Pemberton continued toward the summit, pausing repeatedly to record video commentary about pushing limits in real conditions. Near the summit ridge, electrical activity intensified rapidly. The air carried a metallic odor, and fine hairs on her arms and neck lifted as static built in the charged atmosphere. Faint crackling sounds came from exposed metal along the route, and small blue sparks briefly flickered at the tips of trekking poles nearby. Thunder echoed across surrounding peaks as the storm cell moved directly overhead, reducing visibility in shifting gray cloud. Rather than descending, she stopped on the exposed ridge and positioned her phone on a rock outcrop to capture timed footage against the darkening sky. She adjusted her stance several times to frame the shot, standing fully upright on open ground with no terrain features capable of offering protection. Carabiners on her pack, a metal phone case, and trekking poles in her hands increased conductivity, making her one of the highest points on the ridge. A lightning strike hit the summit area seconds later. The discharge traveled across the rock as ground current, passing through her body via the metal equipment she was holding. The electrical surge disrupted cardiac rhythm instantly and caused deep burns at contact points along her hands and feet. The shock also triggered violent muscle contraction, locking her body rigid before throwing her off balance. She was thrown several feet across uneven stone, striking her shoulder and head against exposed rock. Her phone shattered on impact, and loose equipment scattered across the ridge. She collapsed where she landed, unresponsive, as heavy rain and additional lightning moved across the summit, leaving her fully exposed to the continuing storm. A second strike followed shortly after, striking the same exposed zone as thunder echoed across the ridge. When storm intensity lessened, descending climbers returned cautiously to the summit area and found her unresponsive. Emergency response from lower camps was delayed until lightning activity fully subsided, as rescuers could not enter the exposed zone during active electrical discharge. Medical assessment later confirmed death due to cardiac arrest from lightning strike, with extensive electrical burns and impact injuries documented. Expedition leadership reinforced strict turnaround times during unstable weather and reiterated that exposed high-altitude terrain provides no defense against electrical storms. The incident was recorded as a weather-related fatality, resulting from continued ascent despite clear warning signs. It was July 15, 2013, at Grand Teton Base Camp during an unusually warm summer. East-face routes showed instability from rapid morning warming and freeze-thaw cycles, prompting guides to warn of increased rockfall and postpone climbs until conditions stabilized. Cambria Fullerton, 35, was a corporate attorney from Jackson, Wyoming, whose career was built on persistence and asserting control in high-pressure situations. She approached mountaineering with the same mindset, viewing technical routes as challenges to negotiate rather than hazards to respect. Her climbing experience included non-technical peaks that required endurance, but she had no prior exposure to multi-pitch climbs or routes demanding rope systems and anchor placement. Fullerton's goal was to complete Exum Ridge in a single day to meet personal deadlines, framing guides as service providers whose recommendations could be challenged rather than safety authorities. By mid-morning, Fullerton had begun ascending the lower sections of Exum Ridge. The sun had warmed the east face, casting sharp shadows across jagged rock formations. Loose stones shifted under each footfall, and the thin mountain air carried the scent of heated rock and alpine vegetation. She moved deliberately along the exposed pitches, testing handholds and placing climbing protection, while remaining fully aware of the warnings about unstable terrain. The route demanded constant attention, but Fullerton's focus was split between rapid progression and documenting her climb for personal records. Despite multiple briefings warning of unstable rockfall zones and posted trail closures, Fullerton insisted on continuing. She repeatedly pressured her guide to maintain schedule objectives, dismissed route modifications, and advanced ahead of recommended safety pacing. During early morning exposure at the lower saddle, she ignored falling debris while documenting conditions, asserting that signed waivers and her own judgment justified her choices. Her guides cautioned that thermal expansion and loose rock made certain sections highly unstable, but Fullerton prioritized speed and completion over precaution. As Fullerton climbed higher along the Exum Ridge, the warming sun had already begun loosening small stones along the ridge's upper sections. The exposed metamorphic rock, fractured and jagged from previous freeze-thaw cycles, created a precarious environment where even minor thermal expansion could trigger large-scale rockfall. Fullerton moved quickly, placing protection as she ascended, but a dislodged boulder, roughly 25 pounds, plummeted from an overhanging ledge above her position. It struck her helmet directly, crushing the protective shell and transmitting extreme force through her skull. The impact caused immediate severe traumatic brain injury and cervical spine fractures, disrupting all voluntary nervous system function. The force of the strike broke Fullerton's grip on handholds, causing her to swing slightly before the climbing rope arrested her descent. She dangled precariously from her anchors, unable to support her own weight or regain control. Her body remained rigid from the combination of shock and injury, and loose debris continued to fall from above, striking the rope and surrounding rock surfaces. The sudden movement and vibration added further instability to the immediate area, forcing her guide to maintain tension on the belay line while assessing the situation from above, fully aware that any sudden motion could worsen the injury. Blood from cranial trauma began to soak through her clothing, and her breathing became irregular and shallow, indicating severe neurological compromise. Despite the guide's attempts to provide reassurance and prepare for technical rescue, Fullerton remained unresponsive, with agonal gasps marking the initial stages of brainstem failure. Hypothermia began to develop as she hung suspended in the thin alpine air, the combination of cold wind and metabolic shock compounding the effects of her injuries. Her guide immediately radioed rescue operations, but the narrow, steep terrain prevented immediate medical intervention. Technical ground teams required specialized rope and anchor systems to reach her position safely. By the time rescuers arrived several hours later, Fullerton was confirmed deceased from blunt force trauma sustained during the rockfall. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury with cervical spine fractures, noting that the incident resulted from natural objective hazards rather than equipment failure or guide negligence. Grand Teton National Park issued a formal report on the fatality, and guide services subsequently reinforced hazard acknowledgement protocols and emphasized that client timelines must yield to environmental safety, especially in thermal rockfall conditions. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.